Hi, welcome to my weekly live stream. Today I want to talk about the yamas and niyamas and how you can bring those into your practice. I like to wait just a few moments before I get rolling with the content here to let people come on the live stream. So some people are coming from my Subtle Yoga community page, and some people are coming from my Subtle Yoga Revolution online training page, and then there's people that are on my Subtle Yoga with Kristine Weber page, so many Facebook pages. Anyway, so it's just nice to have a little time for people to get here. Thank you. I see Linda's here. Great. Let me know that you're here. If you have questions, this is a great place to put them. So the topic, yamas and niyamas, and how do you make them come alive in your classes? Because, gosh, I don't know. When I first heard about the yamas and niyamas, I was like, oh no, another list of rules. You know, it just felt really kind of dry and boring to me. And over the years, the way that I often see them used is like, you know, here's some yamas and niyama principles, and they get stuck on a bathroom wall in a yoga studio and not really incorporated into the practice. You know, I mean, that's partly because of the way that we do yoga practice in this country, which is largely asanas, of course, but I think that we have to go beyond the idea of yamas and niyamas as a sort of list and move it into how do we embody it in practice? Like, how do you actually feel these principles as you're practicing? Then they come alive and they feel very relevant and pertinent. Hi, Diane. I'm glad you're here. This is from your question about yamas and niyamas in your classes. So glad you can make it. Okay. So in light of an increasingly immoral, and just sort of Wild West political system that we live in. And that's not just in the United States. I mean, that's everywhere. The purpose and the usefulness of the yamas and niyamas becomes even more relevant, you know. So these principles are universal. You know, Patanjali starts talking about the yamas and niyamas in the sutras, and then he stops and he says, these principles are universal, regardless of time, place, person, culture. These principles are universal. And that's, I think, such a powerful statement. And it also helps us to understand that the yamas and niyamas are not about sort of fixed rules. They're about how we take those rules. It's an applied ethics, if you like. How do we take those rules and apply them in our lives? So they are living. They're living principles. They're not just something to stick on the wall and forget about. They're how do we live them and how do we embody them? That's what's interesting and that's what's useful. Now, the other piece is that the way that Patanjali, I believe, systematized and presented yamas and niyamas. Oh, and by the way, yamas and niyamas are, you know, in terms of Patanjali, yamas and niyamas are the reason that Patanjali stands out from the other yoga, you know, historically from the other yoga that was there. So he adds yamas and niyamas, and that is what radically sort of systematizes. So yamas and niyamas are so important historically, and of course they're important in terms of our, you know, our life. So, okay. So one of the ways I believe that Patanjali systematized these is into these two categories. Why are there two categories? You know, sometimes you get these words like restraints, where just like, why would you call the yamas restraints? I mean, because it just sounds like, you know, anyway, that's an old word. So let's just leave that word aside. And let's bring a more relevant word, which would be co-regulation. Yamas and niyamas are about how do we regulate our nervous system? How are we co-regulating with each other? So you get principles like honesty, you know, like non-harming, ahimsa, honesty, satya, and then non-stealing. And I also like to translate that as like having good boundaries, you know, and taking responsibility for yourself. And then brahmacharya, seeing the interconnectedness of all things. And then aparigraha, which means sustainability, right? Or not taking more than what you need. So when you have these 5 principles, they work really well together in terms of co-regulation. The question is, how do you bring those into your classes? I think taking all 5 principles of the Yamas, or all 10th principles in the Yamas and NIyamas, and trying to do them justice in one class is like, it's just overkill. It's too much, you know. There are certain themes we can talk about, like co-regulation is a great theme to talk about. And then you can talk about the Yamas in sense of like, how do we help each other regulate our nervous systems? That makes sense, doesn't it? And then what you could do, one of the things that I always like to do, like I have my little index card, I don't know, it's like a recipe thing. And I do this all the time. I just always have index cards around, you know, and then I'll write out the principles on the cards. Like I'll write a parigraha on one side, and the other side I wrote on greed, sustainability. And I love to just take the cards and hold them, you know, up to my students as I say, take a card. That's a great thing to do for the class. And like, really, I don't care if they leave with my index card, you know, they can take my index card and go home with it, put it on their fridge or something. And I always am writing those index cards. So that's a really easy way to share the Yamas and NIyamas. So you could take all of them, or you could just do Yamas one week and talk about co-regulation, right? Now, the NIyamas are more about self-regulation because they have to do with cleanliness, shaucha, right? And then contentment, santosha, and then tapas, like a little bit tapas. I really like the word sacrifice. It's like taking a little bit of discomfort for the well-being of others, sacrifice. And then swadhyaya, studying the self, and ishvara pranidhana, like having a commitment and taking a shelter in your higher power. That's all about self-regulation, right? So self-regulation is another excellent theme for a whole class. You say, we're going to do this class on self-regulation. Then you could do asanas that are helpful for like balancing the nervous system, you know, and all asanas are, but you could specifically put some more forward bends in your classes, for example, and have a whole theme on self-regulation. So co-regulation, the Yamas, and then self-regulation, the NIyamas. I love giving index cards as one way that people can reflect on it. Another thing I love to do in yoga classes is ask people to sit in a dyad at the end of class. So you with the person next to you, somebody you feel safe with, and then all I would like you to do is take your card and take a moment and reflect on how that is personally meaningful for you. No big, you know, doesn't have to be a big question like, what did you do wrong? That's why you have this, that's why you got this card. No, that's not where we're going. We're not going with the shame here. We're going with like, how do how can I reflect on that? And how is it meaningful and useful for me in my life? That's it, you know? And then, so dyad work it works really well in my classes to do dyad work at the end of class, and it's really like 3 minutes. And then if somebody likes, they can share with the whole group, but not necessary, and namaste, and we finish class, you know? So having a little bit of time in your classes to incorporate some of these principles is super useful, and people appreciate it. You know, we live, as I mentioned at the beginning of the live stream, we live in such an age of amoral, immoral, you know, that's what we're getting from the top down in terms of politics, in terms of the way business is conducted. And so bringing that back into our lives and understanding that Yamas and NIyamas are about helping us to gain greater resilience, you know, and to live in harmony with each other and with ourselves. I think it's very much appreciated. I think people appreciate having these principles. You know, we have the golden rule in the West, like, you know, don't harm anyone or do unto others as you would have them do unto yourself. Well, that's only one of the 9 of the 10 principles, right? There's 9 more principles of Yamas and NIyamas that can be super useful. And even working with people with an agnostic perspective or even a staunchly atheistic perspective, these are humanist, you know, these really are humanist principles that do not have to be couched in any kind of sectarian terms. You know, they can be understood in a way that matches belief systems. For Christians, they can help to reinforce some of their own belief system, and the same with other people of other religious faiths. And then for people of no religious faith, at least they give this humanist kind of understanding of how we can be together in an ethical way. So we don't have to think about them. We don't have to couch them in any kind of religious terms. I think the languaging is super important. So, you know, I talked about Ishvar Pranidhan. That's the only one that gets a little tricky. It means taking shelter in something higher or spiritual commitment. So for somebody with a belief system that's more agnostic or atheistic, it could be simply in a supportive presence in your life or a sense of the goodness of humanity, taking shelter in the idea of goodness. I mean, it can be something like that. It's much easier, of course, when you're working with people who have a specific religious sentiment. Okay, so I'm going to take a moment here and look through comments. I don't see, I'm just looking. Sometimes it's hard to get to the comments. If you have any questions or comments, this would be a good time. I don't see any here right now, but I do appreciate all of you who joined and gave me little emojis. That's always nice to have emojis here. And let me know if there's other questions you have about the Yamas and NIyamas. I'd be happy to answer those questions after the live stream's over. Resources on the Yamas and NIyamas. I'm looking at my bookshelf here. One resource I really like is a book which is out of print. It's called The Ethics of Love by Vimala McClure. It's a lovely book on the Yamas and NIyamas. And the other one that's great, and I think I can grab it if I can find it here. The other one that's really great is by Nishala Devi. Oh, I can't find it. Nishala Devi's book, which is called The Secret Power of Yoga for Women. Oh, it's so lovely. It has wonderful, wonderful exercises with Yamas and NIyamas and different reflections. So I think that's another way too. And, you know, you can always ask people in the beginning of classes, you can always ask people to reflect on a question, which is really nice. Like, how do you feel, just for example, shocha, cleanliness, right? How do you see, or how do you feel shocha showing up in your daily life? And how is it useful for you? You know, like it could be something very practical, like when I clean off my desk, I feel a little clearer and I feel more focused. You know, it could be something very practical like that. It could be more, you know, it can be more spiritual when I feel like I keep my, you know, I don't fill myself with like too much trashy Netflix, you know, or I don't fill myself with junk food, like how I feel internally. You know, those sorts of questions are always useful for people to take a moment to reflect on. At the beginning or at the end of a class. So those are other ways you can incorporate it. Okay, so Diane wrote, that's great. I was taught by a born-again Christian tutor, which made a few of us turn away from them, the Yamas and NIyamas. I have re-educated myself and you've inspired me even more. Thank you. Thanks, Diane. I'm glad that this is helpful. Yeah, I do think that the principles, if you think about them as living principles, you know, and each breath that you take is an opportunity, each action that you have throughout the day is an opportunity to live those principles a little more deeply in your life, then they're not so like rules, you know. They feel more like the ethics that emerge from within, from practice, rather than rules that are imposed from the outside. Okay, thanks so much for being here, everybody. It's really nice to see you here, and nice to have a chance to connect, and I'll see you next week. Namaste.